The station of Verath Prime floated at the edge of 3-star systems like a jewel suspended in the dark. Neutral ground, sacred ground, the one place in the known galaxy where weapons were checked at the airlock and words were the only currency that mattered. 17 alien civilizations had signed treaties here. 4 wars had ended within these corridors. The air inside smelled of a dozen different atmospheric blends, a strange cocktail of gases that somehow, over centuries of diplomacy, had come to smell like hope. Ambassador Alara Voss stepped off the human transport vessel and into that air, and she breathed it in like she always did, deeply, deliberately, as if reminding herself why she was here. She was 53 years old, with silver threading through her dark hair and laugh lines carved deep around her eyes. Those who didn't know her sometimes mistook those lines for softness. They were not. They were the marks of a woman who had laughed at death threats, smiled through assassination attempts, and once talked a Varath warlord out of bombing a colony ship by spending 11 hours discussing his dead mother's garden. Alara Voss did not do soft. She did patient. She did relentless. She did human. The delegation waiting for her on the docking platform was vast, representatives from 29 of the Galactic Conclave's 47 member civilizations, each one dressed in the formal attire of their species, each one watching the human woman walk toward them with expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Humans were new to the Conclave, barely 80 years since first contact. In galactic terms, they were infants who had stumbled into a room full of giants and had somehow not been stepped on yet. The Kreth ambassador Vorath Kale watched her from the far end of the platform. He was tall even by Kreth standards, 7 feet of gray scaled muscle, with eyes like polished obsidian and a mouth that seemed permanently arranged into something between a sneer and a smile. The Kreth Dominion had been pushing against human expansion for a decade, testing borders, probing defenses, sending strongly worded objections through official channels. They had expected humanity to flinch. Humanity kept expanding anyway, slowly, steadily, stubbornly, like a root finding its way through stone. Vorath Kale watched Alara Voss shake hands, actual physical contact, a bizarre human greeting ritual with 3 different alien delegates, laughing at something one of them said, and he felt something that the Kreth did not often feel toward humans. Contempt. Not the ordinary contempt of one civilization for a lesser one, something deeper, more personal. The Kreth had built their empire on the understanding that the galaxy respected only strength. They had subjugated 11 civilizations over 4 centuries. They had burned worlds that refused to kneel. And here was humanity, this strange, fragile, warm-blooded species barely a century off their home planet, walking into the highest diplomatic stage in the known galaxy with no weapons, no fleet escort, nothing but a middle-aged woman with laugh lines and a briefcase, acting as though she belonged here. It was offensive, it was insulting. It would need to be corrected. Alara, for her part, noticed the Kreth ambassador immediately. She had studied Vorath Kale for 6 months before this summit. His history, his military record, the 3 peace talks he had deliberately derailed, the colony that had been quietly depopulated after refusing Kreth annexation. She knew what he was. She had dealt with his kind before, in human form, in every variety the species produced. Men who confused cruelty for strength and silence for weakness. She caught his gaze across the platform, held it for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be dismissive, and then turned back to the delegate she was speaking with and smiled. The negotiations were scheduled for 7 days. Trade routes, resource rights, the formal recognition of 3 new human colony worlds. Nothing that should have been controversial, nothing that should have been dangerous. That first evening, there was a reception, the kind of elaborate multi-species gathering that required 17 different atmospheric alcoves and a catering team that had trained for a decade just to serve food that wouldn't kill anyone. Alara moved through it like she had been born to these rooms, speaking fragments of 6 alien languages, remembering names, asking after family members she had read about in diplomatic files as though they were old friends. A young aide from the Conclave Secretariat, a blue-skinned Talleth named Sira, fell into step beside her near the end of the evening. Ambassador Voss, Sira said quietly, the Kreth delegation has requested a private meeting, tonight unofficial. Alara considered this for exactly the length of 1 sip of whatever the amber liquid in her glass was. Then she nodded. "Tell them I'll be in my quarters at 23rd hour," she said. And Sira, log the meeting request in the official record before you reply. Sira hesitated. Is that wise if they wanted it unofficial? That's exactly why, Alara said simply and smiled. She walked back to her quarters at 22nd hour, alone, through corridors that smelled of hope, making notes on her datapad about tomorrow's opening arguments. She never made it to 23rd hour. The discovery was made by the station's maintenance crew at the 4th hour of the station's artificial night cycle, a Talleth worker named Gris who had come to deliver a routine atmospheric calibration notice and found the door to the human ambassador's quarters open exactly 3 centimeters. Not unusual, perhaps, except that the light inside was wrong. Too still, too red. Gris pushed the door open and then immediately closed it again, and stood in the corridor for 6 full seconds before his legs remembered how to run. By the time station security arrived, the entire diplomatic wing had been sealed. By the time the Conclave's Emergency Council convened, the forensic report was already in their hands, and the 17 council members who read it went through a progression of expressions that moved from confusion to disbelief to something that none of them had diplomatic language for. Ambassador Alara Voss had been stabbed 17 times. The wounds were not from a firearm or an energy weapon. Those would have been easier to understand, cleaner, more in line with the clinical violence that civilizations occasionally inflicted on one another. These were blade wounds, deliberate, close, personal, the kind of violence that required someone to be in the same room to look, to choose again and again and again. Her diplomatic seal, the physical medallion that represented her authority as Earth's ambassador, a thing recognized under galactic law as sacrosanct, had been shattered and left in pieces on the floor beside her. It was this detail, more than any other, that the Conclave Council members kept returning to in their emergency session. It was not enough to kill her. Whoever had done this had wanted to make a statement. The investigation took 11 hours. It would have taken longer, except that the Kreth delegation made it simple. They didn't hide it. The evidence was there in the station's security architecture, a corridor access code used by a Kreth diplomatic aide, traces of Kreth biological material that their species' physiology naturally shed in stress, and a blade recovered from a waste disposal unit that matched Kreth military-grade manufacturing. Standard issue, not even an attempt at deniability. When the Conclave's investigative panel presented their findings to the full assembly, Voreth Kale sat in the Kreth delegation's seats and listened to the evidence with his arms folded and his obsidian eyes half closed, like a man waiting for something he found mildly tedious to finish. When the panel concluded, he stood. "The Galactic Conclave," he said, his translated voice smooth and deliberate, "has spent 2 centuries building rules for the conduct of civilized species. We do not dispute the findings." The chamber went silent. "The human presence at this table has always been provisional," Voreth Kale continued. "They are young, impulsive, expanding into territories that older civilizations have prior claims to. Ambassador Voss was the instrument of that expansion. We removed the instrument." He paused, letting that settle. "Humans send lambs to tables meant for wolves. We have simply reminded the galaxy of the difference." He sat back down. The silence in the chamber lasted for a long time. Then the protests came, overlapping, outraged, a cacophony of alien voices demanding censure, demanding sanctions, demanding consequences. The Conclave's chair called for order 3 times before achieving it. Emergency motions were filed. A formal condemnation was drafted by 6-member civilizations within the hour, its language sharp and precise and absolutely, utterly meaningless in any practical sense. The Kreth sat through all of it with the patience of a predator that has already eaten. Meanwhile, 17 light-years away, a human communications officer on the UES Resolute received the encoded transmission from Verath Prime, decoded it, read it once, and then sat very still at his station for a moment. Then he picked up the internal comm and said, in a voice carefully emptied of everything, "Captain, you need to come to the bridge." The message reached Earth 6 hours later. It arrived in the office of Secretary General Amara Diallo at 03:00 station time, delivered by her chief of staff who had driven to her residence personally rather than send it electronically. Amara Diallo read it at her kitchen table in her night clothes, a cup of tea going cold beside her hand, and she read it 3 times. Then she set it down flat on the table, placed both palms on either side of it, and looked at nothing for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and absolutely level. "Wake the Joint Military Council," she said. "All of them now." Her chief of staff hesitated. "Madam Secretary, it's the middle of the night." "I know what time it is," Amara said. She picked up her tea, found it cold, set it back down. "Wake them." Across the planet, in every city, in every time zone, people were beginning to hear. It moved through human networks the way grief always moves, first a trickle, then a flood. Alara Voss had been on the covers of magazines. She had given interviews that people watched with their families. She had been in the way that only certain public figures become, a person that strangers felt they knew. The grief was real. It was vast. And underneath it, quiet and patient and enormous, something else was building, something that had no name in the galactic conclave's vocabulary, because no civilization had ever been foolish enough to make humanity use it. For 72 hours, humanity said nothing. No diplomatic communiques, no emergency broadcasts, no responses to the 47 separate messages sent by conclave member civilizations offering condolences, explanations, assurances, or carefully worded suggestions that humanity should allow the conclave's legal process to handle the matter. The human ambassador's office on Verath Prime locked its doors. Human delegates to every subsidiary conclave body stopped attending sessions. Human trade vessels, which moved through 17 major shipping lanes carrying goods that half the galaxy had quietly come to depend on, went dark on their transponders, still moving, but no longer communicating. The conclave called it grief. They called it shock. They called it the understandable reaction of a young civilization that had never faced something like this before. They were wrong on all three counts. On the 29th hour of the silence, a Talleth trade minister named Voss Kellarith, no relation to the ambassador, simply a coincidence of name that the universe apparently found amusing, received an automated notification that the human-operated atmospheric processing components scheduled for delivery to Talleth Station 7 had been placed on indefinite logistical hold. He filed an inquiry with the Human Trade Bureau and received no response. By hour 40, 3 separate space stations reported that human-manufactured life support components were running low with no resupply in transit. These were not things the stations had ever worried about before. Human supply chains were famously reliable, almost compulsively so. Engineers on those stations began running calculations on backup systems and didn't like the numbers they got. By hour 60, the conclave's economic analysts had begun mapping humanity's role in galactic trade infrastructure and were producing reports that their superiors were reading with increasing discomfort. In 80 years of spacefaring, humans had not simply participated in galactic trade. They had threaded themselves through it, quietly, methodically, becoming the manufacturer of last resort for dozens of critical component categories, the maintenance provider for systems that older civilizations had stopped training their own engineers to fix, the shipping backbone for routes that weren't profitable enough for larger operators but were essential for smaller ones. Nobody had noticed because humans were friendly. They showed up, they worked hard, they charged fair prices, they made friends. Nobody watches the foundation of a building while the architecture is beautiful. On the 61st hour, every human vessel in the known galaxy changed course simultaneously. Not retreating, repositioning. Moving to specific coordinates with the kind of coordinated precision that required pre-planning on a scale the conclave hadn't imagined humanity capable of. From the outside, it looked like a vast, silent machine activating after years of stillness. The Kreth Military Intelligence Division filed 17 urgent reports in 6 hours. Their analysts, who had spent a decade assessing human military capability and consistently rating it as moderate and developing, were now pulling historical data they hadn't previously considered important and finding, buried in 80 years of records, evidence of a civilization that had never, not once, stopped preparing for the war it publicly insisted it didn't want. Human defense spending, adjusted for economic growth, had been quietly, consistently enormous. Their shipyards, which humanity had always described as commercial construction facilities, had been dual-capable for decades. Their civilian fleet, massive, distributed, crewed by humans who were universally trained in basic vessel operation and emergency protocols, could, with the right orders, become something else entirely. Had become something else entirely. On Kreth Prime, the High Dominion Council convened an emergency session. The warlord premier, an ancient Kreth male named Drevath Sorn who had ruled for 40 years and fought in 9 wars, listened to his analysts' briefings, and then asked a question that no Kreth leader had ever had reason to ask before. How many ships do the humans actually have? The answer, when his intelligence chief delivered it, was not what anyone in the room expected. There was a long silence after the number was spoken. Then Drevath Sorn did something that his council had never seen him do in 40 years. He asked the question again, as if perhaps he had misheard. He had not misheard. On the 72nd hour, Earth's silence ended. Not with diplomacy, not with a press release, not with the kind of carefully managed public statement that the conclave expected from member civilizations in moments of crisis. It ended with a single transmission, broadcast simultaneously on every known frequency, in every language the conclave's translation systems could process. It was 11 seconds long. Admiral Caden-Rourke was not a man who had been designed by a comfortable life. He was 61 years old, built like the warships he had spent 4 decades commanding, not elegant, not streamlined, but solid in a way that suggested he had been engineered specifically to absorb punishment and remain functional. His face was a map of consequence, a jaw that had been broken twice and reset slightly wrong, a scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone from a hull breach on the UES Carthage 30 years ago, eyes that were an unremarkable shade of gray and missed absolutely nothing. He had fought in 2 small wars and 3 large ones, all of them against human factions in humanity's messy, violent early expansion period. He had watched people die in vacuum, in fire, in the slow, cruel way that a damaged ship becomes a coffin. He had become an admiral not because he enjoyed war, but because he was very, very good at understanding it. Not just the tactics, not just the logistics, but the geometry of it, the way violence existed in relation to everything that came before and after, the way the decision to fight was never just about the fight itself. He had been hoping, privately, for the last decade, that he would retire before humanity needed him for the purpose he had spent that decade quietly preparing for. He was standing on the bridge of the UES Alara Voss, renamed by executive order of the Secretary-General 48 hours after the ambassador's death. A deliberate choice, a statement, when the order came through to make the broadcast. He read the approved script once. Then he set it aside and looked out at the star field beyond the view screen for a long moment. Then he turned to the communications officer and said, "Open the channel." He didn't read from the script. He didn't need to. "My name is Admiral Caden-Rourke, commander of the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet. The Kreth Dominion murdered our diplomat. Her name was Alara Voss. She went to your table unarmed, as diplomats do, because that is what the law requires and because she believed in the law. You answered her with 17 stab wounds and a broken seal." He paused for exactly 2 seconds. "We gave you diplomacy. You answered with a knife." Another pause. "We will not be sending another diplomat." 11 seconds, the channel closed. Across the galaxy, in diplomatic offices and military command centers and civilian living quarters, the message played and replayed. It was the replaying that mattered, the way beings of every species found themselves listening to it a second time. A third time, not because it was unclear, but because it was so completely, terrifyingly clear. The Conclave's secretary primary, an ancient Varath named Oren Tal, who had held his office for 60 years and had personally mediated 32 interstellar conflicts, watched the broadcast in his office and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He had, in his 6 decades of diplomatic experience, developed an instinct for the moments when situations became irreversible. He had learned to recognize the specific quality of silence that followed a threshold being crossed, the silence that didn't mean pause, but meant before and after. This was that silence. He opened a direct channel to the Kreth High Council immediately, bypassing 17 layers of normal diplomatic protocol. "You need to offer reparations," he told Drevath Sorn without preamble. "Full, public, unconditional now before they move." Drevath Sorn, who had faced down 3 civilizations in his career and broken all 3 of them, looked at Oren Tal through the comm channel and made the last catastrophic mistake of his leadership. He said, "The Kreth Dominion does not negotiate under threat." On the bridge of the UES Alara Voss, Admiral Rourke received confirmation that all 7 fleets had achieved their jump coordinates. "Admiral," his executive officer said quietly, "we are ready." Rourke looked at the star field one more time. Somewhere out there, 17 light-years away, was a station that smelled like hope, where a woman with laugh lines and a briefcase had believed in the power of talking, until the moment someone took that belief from her. He thought about Alara Voss the way soldiers think about the thing they're actually fighting for, underneath all the strategy and the orders and the terrible geometry of war. Then he said, "Execute." 7 fleets vanished from their positions simultaneously. 7 fleets appeared simultaneously at the edges of Kreth space. The storm had been silent long enough. The Kreth border fortress of Drevath Station, named after the warlord premier himself, a monument to Kreth military pride and 40 years of unbroken dominance, had a crew of 12,000 soldiers, 400 combat vessels in its docking bays, and defensive systems that had never been seriously tested because no civilization in the Conclave had ever been willing to try. It fell in 4 hours and 17 minutes. The commander of the human assault force, Fleet Captain Yena Marsh, reviewed the battle record afterward and noted 3 things for the after-action report. First, the Kreth defensive systems were excellent, sophisticated, layered, clearly the product of centuries of military engineering. Second, the Kreth soldiers had fought with genuine courage, holding their positions longer than the engagement models had predicted. Third, none of it had mattered, and she wanted to understand why clearly enough to explain it. What she wrote in the report was this: "The Kreth military doctrine is built on the assumption that attackers have a breaking point. They fight to find it. They have never encountered an attacker that doesn't have one." Human military history was long and ugly and littered with the wreckage of civilizations that humans had built and broken and built again. For 10,000 years before they reached the stars, humans had been doing nothing but fighting each other, finding new ways to hurt, new ways to persist, new ways to adapt in the middle of catastrophe and keep moving forward. It had been terrible. It had also been, in the cold mathematics of military capability, an education that no other species in the Conclave had received. Human soldiers, when wounded, became dangerous. Human units, when reduced below effective combat strength, improvised rather than retreating. Human commanders, when their plans failed, made new plans in real time rather than falling back on doctrine. The Kreth had a word for soldiers who kept fighting past logical stopping points. It translated, roughly, as the broken ones, warriors who had lost the capacity for rational self-preservation. They did not have a word for a civilization where that described almost everyone. By the end of the first day, 3 Kreth border fortresses had fallen, and 2 more were under siege. The Kreth fleet that had launched to intercept the human advance found itself engaged by human vessels that behaved in ways their tactical models hadn't predicted, not because the humans were doing anything exotic, but because the models had been built on the assumption that ships would maneuver to reduce their own damage. Human ships maneuvered to maximize enemy damage, accepting hits that would have caused other species' commanders to disengage, and kept pressing. On Kreth Prime, the military high command watched the battle feeds with growing silence. Drevath Sorn asked for casualty projections. His chief of staff delivered them. Sorn reviewed them once, requested a recount, and was told the numbers were correct. The projections showed that if the current rate of Kreth military attrition continued, the Kreth Dominion would cease to be a functioning military power within 3 weeks. 3 weeks, not months, not years, 3 weeks. Sorn had been in power for 40 years. He had subjugated 11 civilizations. He had operated always on the foundational belief that the question in any conflict was not whether his side would win, but at what cost. He had never, not once, sat in front of a projection that suggested his side might simply lose. He ordered a counteroffensive on 6 fronts simultaneously. It was the right tactical response. It was also, as Admiral Rourke noted later in his own after-action documentation, precisely what humanity had been waiting for, because a military that commits to 6 simultaneous offensives is a military that has stopped defending its center. The human fleets let the counteroffensive extend itself, then they hit the center. The Kreth had built their military for the wars they had always fought, against civilizations that wanted territory, that wanted resources, that had political objectives they were willing to trade against at the negotiating table. Against enemies that, at some point, would calculate that the cost of continuing exceeded the value of winning. Humanity was not fighting for territory. They were not fighting for resources. They were fighting for a woman's name, and there was no number that could be put on that which would make the math work in the Kreth's favor. 17-year-old Kreth soldiers at border outposts, watching their defensive networks collapse on tactical displays, began to understand something that their leadership had catastrophically failed to understand before starting any of this. There was a difference between a civilization that could not fight back and one that had simply chosen not to. Humanity had chosen, for 80 years, not to. They had stopped choosing that. The Galactic Conclave held an emergency session on the 14th day of the conflict. The chamber was full in a way that emergency sessions rarely were. Every member civilization had sent its highest available representative, because everyone in the known galaxy understood that what was happening in Kreth space was not simply a war. It was a demonstration, and demonstrations required an audience. The feed from the front was available to anyone with a receiver and a decoder, which meant essentially everyone. Across 17 civilizations, beings of dozens of species were watching human warships do things that military analysts had confidently declared impossible 3 weeks earlier. The analysis from those same experts, now revised, was arriving on the desks of every military high command in the conclave. The revisions were significant. Previous assessments of human military capability, it turned out, had been built on a systematic error. Analysts had measured what humanity had deployed and assumed it represented what humanity could deploy. Nobody had asked why a civilization with humanity's industrial base and military history would choose to maintain such a relatively small active fleet. Nobody had considered that restraint is not the same as limitation. The conclave's military observers, watching the engagement data in real time, were discovering the answer. Humanity had maintained a small active fleet because a large active fleet would have alarmed neighbors that humanity had no interest in alarming. But the shipyard capacity, the trained reserves, the dual-use civilian vessels, the logistical infrastructure, all of it had been there, waiting like a deep breath held for 80 years. The Kreth had found the exhale. In the diplomatic corridors outside the main chamber, conversations were happening that would never appear in official records. A Vareth defense minister pulled aside a Taloth counterpart and asked, quietly, whether Taloth had any outstanding issues with human interests that hadn't been formally resolved. The Taloth minister said, with equal quiet, that they had been meaning to revisit a resource rights dispute from 12 years ago, and felt that now was an excellent time to resolve it in humanity's favor. Similar conversations, in various forms, happened 11 times that day. A minor civilization called the Herath, who occupied 3 systems adjacent to human space and had maintained a low-grade border dispute with humanity for 6 years, sent an unprompted communication to the Human Foreign Affairs Office offering a full settlement on all contested points. The communication arrived while human military forces were in the process of dismantling the Kreth's 3rd largest military installation, and the timing was, the Herath ambassador stressed, entirely coincidental. Inside the chamber, the conclave's debate was loud and fractured. Several member civilizations argued for intervention, though the debate over what form intervention should take revealed that nobody was quite willing to place themselves between humanity and its objective. Others argued for a ceasefire resolution, a formal conclave demand that both sides stand down. This proposal died when someone pointed out, with uncomfortable accuracy, that the Kreth were not really a side anymore so much as a progressively smaller military capability, and that demanding humanity stand down to protect an institution that had issued a strongly worded condemnation in response to the murder of their ambassador was unlikely to be received well. Orenthal, the secretary primary, watched the debate from his chair and said very little. He was thinking about an old Vareth expression that roughly translated as, "The time to build the fence is before the bull reaches the field." The conclave had not built a fence. The conclave had watched a bull be murdered in its pen and issued a formal condemnation of the murderer, and then acted surprised when the herd arrived. Through all of it, Admiral Rourke said nothing publicly. The human government said nothing publicly. There were no press conferences, no diplomatic statements, no signals of what would satisfy humanity short of complete Kreth military collapse. The Kreth, desperate, attempted to open back-channel negotiations through a third-party intermediary. The message came back unsigned, untranslated, and consisted of a single word in the original Kreth language. The word meant no. On civilian networks across the conclave, the 11-second broadcast played on a loop that nobody had programmed and nobody seemed able to stop. We gave you diplomacy. You answered with a knife. We will not be sending another diplomat. Beings who had never met a human and had no direct stake in the conflict found themselves watching the gray-eyed admiral say those words for the 4th time, the 5th time, and feeling something that crossed species lines, not just fear of what humanity was doing, but recognition of why. Every species in the conclave had lost someone. Every species understood what it meant to have a wound that didn't close. The difference was that most of them had eventually been convinced, by calculation or coercion, to let it go. Nobody had ever asked humanity to let this go. They were beginning to understand why. On the 19th day, the human fleet reached Kreth Prime. It was a sight that would be documented in records across the galaxy for centuries afterward. A fleet of that size, in high orbit over a civilization's homeworld, with the capability to end everything below in a matter of hours. Every sensor array in the system was tracking them. Every military commander who had ever assessed human capability and found it wanting was watching and revising their assessment in real time, and in some cases revising themselves into a kind of quiet existential crisis. And then humanity did the thing that nobody expected. They stopped. Not retreating, stopping, holding position. The fleet hung in orbit over Kreth Prime for 3 hours and 17 minutes without firing a single shot, and in those 3 hours and 17 minutes, every being in the conclave who was watching those feeds learned something about humanity that the 80 years of trade agreements and diplomatic smiles and cultural exchange programs had somehow failed to communicate. When Admiral Rourke finally gave his orders, they were not what the Kreth High Command, huddled in their planetary defense center, had been preparing for. He did not order a planetary strike. He did not order the kind of overwhelming assault that would have been militarily logical given humanity's position and capability. He ordered something that required more precision, more restraint, more control than simply destroying everything, and therefore demonstrated more power than destruction would have. Military infrastructure only, Rourke said, standing at the tactical display, his voice the same level it always was. Every weapons platform, every military command facility, every shipyard and weapons factory. You leave the hospitals, you leave the power grid, you leave the civilian water systems, you leave the schools. His operations commander, a sharp-eyed woman named Captain Dira Osai, looked at him for a moment. "That's a harder target set, sir. More risk to our people." "I know," Rourke said. "Do it anyway." The campaign that followed was the most precisely executed military operation in Conclave recorded history. Human forces moved through Kreth Prime's defensive architecture with a methodical completeness that left military observers simultaneously awed and disturbed. Every gun battery, every command bunker, every warship in the orbital yards reduced to wreckage, while 6 meters away a civilian transit hub ran normally. Power stayed on in residential areas, while the Defense Ministry building next door became debris. It took 11 hours. When it was over, Kreth Prime was intact. Its people were alive. Its history, its culture, its cities untouched. Only the machinery of violence had been removed, extracted with the precision of a surgeon who had decided that the tumor needed to come out, but the patient needed to live. In the defense center, Drevath Sorn sat among his surviving commanders and looked at the tactical display that now showed nothing where his planetary defenses had been, and he understood, with the particular clarity that only total defeat can produce, that this had never been about conquest. Humanity didn't want Kreth Prime. Humanity didn't want any of it. What they had wanted, from the very beginning, was to be taken seriously. He requested terms of surrender through the Conclave emergency channel. The response came within 12 minutes, which, given that it required routing through Conclave communications infrastructure and required a human decision-maker to be available at that precise moment, was impossibly fast. It implied that humanity had been waiting for exactly this message and had been ready with exactly this answer. The terms were a single page long. No territorial concessions, no reparations payments, no dissolution of the Kreth government, one condition. The Kreth Dominion would present its ambassador, Vorath Kale, to the Galactic Conclave in full formal session to answer for the murder of Ambassador Alara Voss. By her name, in her name, publicly, before every member civilization. That was all. Drevath Sorn read the terms 3 times. He had spent his career building an empire on the principle that strength demanded tribute and victory demanded spoils. He had never encountered a victor that wanted only an acknowledgement. He couldn't decide if it was the most merciful thing he had ever seen or the most devastating, because he understood, reading that single condition, that humanity was not trying to punish the Kreth so much as they were trying to teach the galaxy. He signed the surrender. In his office on Verath Prime, Oren Tal received the confirmation and sat back in his chair and felt the specific, exhausted relief of a man who had been dreading a much worse ending. Then he opened his message queue and began composing the notifications to all 47 member civilizations. The war had lasted 19 days. In 19 days, humanity had done what no other conclave civilization had managed in 4 centuries of trying. They had broken the Kreth Dominion's military completely, without losing a single engagement, without committing a single documented atrocity, and without taking anything that wasn't theirs to take. They had also, in those 19 days, made every other civilization in the known galaxy quietly review their own history of interactions with humanity and consider, with renewed seriousness, whether there was anything in that history that they should perhaps address proactively. The answer, in 8 out of 47 cases, was yes. The Conclave's Hall of Accord could hold 3,000 beings in its main chamber, and had been designed to make everyone who entered it feel appropriately small. The ceiling was a dome of transparisteel showing real-time star field above, the walls inlaid with the seals of every civilization that had signed the Conclave Charter, and the floor was a mosaic of the 47 founding symbols in materials that had been transported from each member world specifically for the purpose. It was a room built to remind its occupants that they were part of something larger than themselves. On the 43rd day after the murder of Ambassador Alara Voss, that room was full. Every member civilization had sent their highest representative. The media feeds of 17 civilizations were broadcasting live. In the gallery above the main floor, a crowd of observers that represented almost every sapient species in the known galaxy watched in silence as the Kreth ambassador, Vorath Kale, walked to the center of the chamber floor. He looked different. Not physically, he was still 7 feet of gray scale and hard muscle, still the same being who had stood in this same chamber 3 weeks ago and delivered a speech about lambs and wolves. But something in the way he moved had changed. He walked like a man who had been handed a weight he hadn't expected and was still learning what it meant to carry it. He stopped in the center of the floor. He looked at the human delegation, a small group, 12 people in formal black, seated in their assigned position in the chamber. He found the face of Secretary General Amara Diallo and held it. Then he did something that no Kreth in recorded history had done before a conclave assembly. He spoke a name. Ambassador Alara Voss. His translated voice was quiet, even in that vast chamber it carried. She came to this station under the protection of conclave law, unarmed, to represent her people's interests at a table where all interests are meant to be equal. She was killed by agents under our direction. Her death was ordered by the Kreth Dominion. I was the instrument of that order. He paused. The chamber was absolutely silent. Her name was Alara Voss. We took her life. There is no justification for this. There is no diplomatic framing that makes it other than what it was. We killed your diplomat. We were wrong. It was not a long speech. It was not eloquent. It was also, in its directness, more honest than anything the conclave chamber had heard in Oren Tal's 60 years of tenure, and he had heard thousands of speeches. He sat in his chair and felt something unfamiliar for a career diplomat, the absence of subtext. Just a statement, just a name, just an accounting. Amara Diallo listened to the full translation before responding. Then she stood and addressed the chamber in the way that Alara Voss had once taught her, years ago, when Amara was a junior diplomat and Alara was already a legend. Back straight, voice level, looking at the people she was speaking to rather than the notes in front of her. The United Earth government accepts this acknowledgement, she said. We do not accept it as sufficient, but we accept it as a beginning. She sat back down. In the weeks that followed, the conclave moved with unusual speed. The Voss provision, formally titled the Diplomatic Sanctity Amendment to the Conclave Charter, was drafted, debated, and ratified by 43 of the 47 member civilizations within 30 days. It established, in language that left no room for interpretation, that the murder of any recognized diplomatic envoy constituted an act of war against their entire civilization, triggering automatic conclave review and collective response mechanisms that could not be vetoed by any single member. It was named for Alara Voss. Her name was engraved in the physical charter document, alongside the seal of Earth by hand, by a conclave archivist who had never met her and spent 3 hours on the lettering anyway because it felt like it mattered. Admiral Rourke attended the ratification ceremony and then immediately submitted his retirement papers. He had been ready to retire before all of this, and he was more ready now. He spent the ceremony standing quietly at the back of the hall, watching the signatures go down, thinking about the geometry of things, how a decision made in contempt by a being who thought himself a wolf had, through the strange calculus of consequence, produced a protection that would outlast every living person in this room. He thought that was probably what Alara Voss would have wanted. He had read enough of her work to believe it. Humanity withdrew its fleets over the following 2 weeks, returning to their pre-conflict positions with the same coordinated precision with which they had deployed. The supply chains came back online. The trade routes opened. The life support components began shipping again to the stations that had been nervously running calculations on backup systems. The galaxy resumed, but not quite to what it had been before, because that before no longer existed. 14 months after the ceremony, a young Kreth diplomat named Sira Voth arrived at the human embassy on Earth. She was 23 years old and had been 14 when Vorath Kale ordered Alara Voss's murder, and 11 when she had decided she wanted to be a diplomat instead of a soldier, in defiance of every expectation her culture had for a young Kreth female. She had studied human diplomatic history for 4 years. She had read every transcript of every negotiation Alara Voss had ever conducted. She arrived at the embassy door nervous enough that her scales were doing an involuntary stress response, and her hands were not entirely steady. The human embassy official who met her at the door was a woman about Alara's age, silver-threaded hair, laugh lines, the kind of eyes that had seen enough to be calm about almost anything. Her name, according to the placard at the reception desk, was Deputy Ambassador Chen. She took one look at Sira Voth standing in the doorway with her unsteady hands and offered a human greeting, extended hand, the physical contact gesture that the Kreth had always found baffling, and smiled with the particular warmth of someone who found young diplomats making their difficult first visits genuinely moving. "Welcome to Earth," Deputy Ambassador Chen said. "Come in, I'll make tea." Sira Voth took the offered hand and shook it, carefully, and stepped across the threshold. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure." She stopped, started again. "I want to do this well, diplomacy. I want to learn how to do it the right way." Deputy Ambassador Chen handed her a cup of tea, hot, amber, smelling of something Sira couldn't identify, and looked at her with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't judgment, but was something in between that had no name in the Kreth language and might not have had one in any language. "We always preferred talking," she said simply. "We just needed the galaxy to understand what happens when you make talking impossible." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Sit down, let's start at the beginning." Outside the embassy window, Earth turned green and blue and white, improbable and stubborn, a world that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of survival, and then carried that art to the stars. In the Hall of Accord, 17 light-years away, a name was engraved in a charter that would last longer than the people who wrote it. Alara Voss. Not forgot, not a casualty, a foundation. The galaxy had learned something, in those 19 days, that it would not forget. That there was a civilization among them that smiled at diplomatic receptions, and negotiated in good faith and believed, sincerely, in the power of words. And that this same civilization, when pushed past the point where words were possible, would respond with a precision and a fury and a terrible patient completeness that made the wolves of the galaxy look very carefully at the lambs and wonder if they had been reading the situation correctly all along. They had not. The lambs had always known exactly what they were doing. They had simply been hopping, they would never have to prove it.